Hello, welcome to Face Health, everyone. Thank you for joining us again for our Thursday evening webinar on vaccinations. It's a very timely webinar given that this week is Immunization Week 2021. So for those of you who are not familiar with Face Health, I'm Dr. Zarmi Shanawaz. I'm a family physician as well as an integrative health coach and medical director here at Face Health. And Face Health is the first digital children's health and wellness platform where we really try to deliver 360-degree care to your children and their families. So if you do visit our platform, you will see that there are providers from all across the board, ranging from pediatricians and nurse practitioners like our guest speaker today, as well as yoga practitioners, creative arts therapists, developmental therapists, and of course, mental health counselors as well. So we are really focused on enhancing collaboration between providers and giving your child the very best care that they need. So we do hope that you can take a look at our platform and our providers that we have. This evening, I'm very excited to introduce our speaker for tonight, Professor Debra Cosco. Hello, Deb.
Hello.
Can you hear us and see us?
Hear you? Yes, yes.
Good. Okay. So a little bit about Deb. Professor Debra Cosco is a board-certified family nurse practitioner with over 25 years of experience in primary care, infectious diseases, urgent or emergency care. She has held medical appointments at the Johns Hopkins University, the University of Maryland, and Duke University. She has extensive experience in program development and management areas. Areas of specialization, include global health, HIV/AIDS, infectious diseases, and pediatrics. So it's really the whole host there. Debra is currently the chair of the North Carolina Immunization Coalition, and she also sits on the North Carolina COVID-19 Immunization Advisory Council. So I couldn't think of anyone better than to have a conversation with tonight than Debra. Debra, thanks for your time.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So let's get in. I always like to start these conversations off with a bold statement. So I just want to share this particular statement with our audience, which let me go ahead and share my screen. Oh dear, excuse me. There we go. Okay, so Deb, natural immunity is better than vaccine-acquired immunity. Let's start the conversation off with that.
Well, that is a wonderful place to start. And one, we have to say, well, what is natural immunity? What's vaccine-acquired? Natural immunity would be if you were exposed to a pathogen that causes an infectious disease, and then you develop immunity, which is protection from it in the future. That's natural immunity. Vaccine-acquired immunity, you receive the vaccine, and that provides you the protection. Well, why is one better than the other? And it's really through natural immunity, you could get very sick, ill, perhaps die from that infection. So rather than risk that to develop natural immunity, we give vaccines. So therefore you have the immunity without ever the risk of becoming ill from that disease or dying from that disease.
Right. And of course, one of the other things we need to think about with natural immunity is how long does that immunity actually last when you do have that primary infection?
And in some cases, it can be a lifetime, and in others, it's not. And it could be very short. Whereas vaccine-acquired immunity, we've done the science. We know how to space the immunizations and provide that lifelong protection.
Right. So let's move along. What are vaccines and how do they work? I mean, we've been talking for the last several months intensely about vaccines, about how they come about, how they're created, concerns about timing. So if we can go a little bit into the science behind, what these things actually are.
Now, what I'm going to speak to is vaccines in general,
Yeah.
not the ones that are that we're all talking about today. But vaccines actually train our immune system to create proteins that fight disease, and these are antibodies. So it's training, and so it trains our immune system. It has the antibodies now to this infection, and so say you were exposed to it, it would prevent it. It allows the cells to understand when, if it were, to recognize it and then stop it from causing disease.
Right. And the vaccines that we do use, or at least the technology that we're using at the moment, they are different. Different vaccines work differently. Different vaccines are produced differently.
They are. Some have a small speck of an inactivated component of that disease. Others use other viruses that can mimic the virus that causes that disease. And then, of course, the newest, even though it's not that new, is the mRNA that everyone's talking about with Pfizer and Moderna, which is a different technology, but it works in a very similar way. It modifies and attaches itself still to actually the spike protein on the coronavirus, and then inactivates the coronavirus. Slightly different technology. It's not using inactivated other viruses. It is a technology unto its own, but it's not new. I know a lot of people are concerned that this is brand new. It's actually been around in the lab and been worked on for several decades, looking at cancer treatments, as well as a platform for a potential Ebola vaccine. So it has been around a while, but it is for the first time used in the general population for a vaccine.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point that you make, is that often we don't talk in a public forum about certain medical technologies just because it's not particularly relevant at the time. And so then when we do suddenly start talking about these in the public forum, unfortunately, we do get some kind of misconception that, oh, well, this must be brand new. And then, of course, that leads to concern and distrust.
Absolutely. And when we were talking about how vaccines work, I mean, earlier, there's two different kinds of immunity. Maybe we'll step back to immunity a little bit. There's active and passive immunity. Active immunity is when a germ occurs and we have exposure to that pathogen. And then the body, as I think I said a little bit earlier, develops antibodies to protect us, to neutralize that infection, say we were to get it. Then passive immunity is when we develop antibodies that come in from outside of our body. Now, how could that possibly be passive immunity? That's from, say, the mother through her placenta to her unborn child, also through breast milk. You can get it, again, getting antibodies from the outside the body. And then we have several serums. We have antivenom that's produced through another animal. So those antibodies, again, are produced outside the body, but then we can use them to protect us if we were to get, say, a snake bite, poisonous snake bite.
Right. And I just actually do want to, because I think it's an important point that we should highlight, again, given a lot of the current conversations around this. We had talked about introducing a part of the virus. There are the live attenuated vaccines, and then there are the inactivated vaccines. And I think some of the misconceptions that people feel are like, well, you're putting a virus into me. How can that be good for me? So if you could just highlight that point again and talk about how those live attenuated virus vaccines actually work.
Well, it's a very, very minute component of that disease, that live attenuated virus, very small. And it is not enough to create disease, but it helps stimulate the body to create these antibodies because they're being exposed to that. And that's how it works. And it's amazing science. It's been around for a long time and incredibly successful. And we'll talk a bit about some of the great successes we've had in vaccines over the years.
Absolutely. Thank you. So moving along, this is a myth that I think we've all heard. I've given the answer away, haven't I? I shouldn't have said that. We don't need to vaccinate because infection rates are already so low in the United States. Can you explain what this means?
Yes, and here's a perfect example is polio. Well, why are we inoculating children and adults? Why do we receive the polio vaccine when we haven't seen polio in years here? And the reason being is it can always be reintroduced. Now, that brings us to, let's talk a little bit about herd immunity, because that's a piece of this answer. You have to have a certain percentage of the population needs to have immunity so that the virus does not continue to infect others. And so even though, for example, we'll go back to polio, that we haven't seen it in our country for decades, it can still be introduced by others coming from other countries that might still have polio. And so if you're not inoculated or immune to the polio, you could get it. Now, certainly we have herd immunity for polio in our country, but if enough people decided I'm not going to be vaccinated against polio, then the numbers of vaccinated go down. And then when there is some circulating polio, someone could then contract the infection.
Right. And actually, before we come on to this, Deb, let's talk about, you already mentioned herd immunity, which was something that I wanted to talk about. Can we talk a little bit about efficacy rates? So when we talk about vaccine, and remember, we're not just talking about COVID here. We are talking about children's vaccinations in general, whether it's polio, measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, etc. What are we actually talking about when we say, oh, a vaccine is X% effective, or this particular vaccine is more effective than another? What are we actually saying there?
Well, efficacy, and we've been hearing this so much, of course, because of COVID, is what's the efficacy rate of these new vaccines? Actually, that's a term often used in clinical trials or clinical research. And it's saying how much, what is the percent of likeliness that you would actually contract the illness? So if something is 95% efficacious, there's 95% less likely that you will get that infection. Now, again, that's with clinical trials and clinical research. And I wanted to bring up too, that now we're starting to hear some other numbers with the COVID around efficacy. The reason being is now people have had the vaccine for some time, and now we can look at the effectiveness of it in the real world. So again, efficacy tends to go with clinical research. They came out, you have a clinical trial. This is how effective this vaccine is. But then in real world use, we'll start seeing new numbers. And I don't want that to confuse people, but it is looking at the real world experience with the vaccine, like we have for others that we've been giving for many, many years. So again, let me repeat, if it's 90%, say if they say a vaccine is 95% effective or efficacious, that means that it's 95% less likely that you would get the infection.
Got it. Thank you. So now let's move along to this, which has been around now for years, unfortunately. Can we address measles, mumps, rubella, and its link with autism?
Well, first we have to say, yes, people are talking about this and still are, following research that was published in The Lancet, which is a British medical journal in 1998, written and published by Dr. Andrew Wakefield. Had looked at some correlation between some children who were diagnosed with autism and the number of children in England who had received the MMR vaccine, and published this as there was a link. However, that research was debunked. It was found to be poorly designed. There were a total of 8 children that had autism, and there were a couple Other researchers then followed on, and there's been many, many studies since then that completely debunked any correlation between measles, mumps, and rubella and autism. For one, the children that were diagnosed with autism, all of the children, it was around the age when all children were receiving their measles, mumps, rubella. So you couldn't say that normally autism would be diagnosed around the time one might receive the vaccine. So they say, well, in the general population, there's going to be X amount of autism no matter what. And they were trying to link that vaccine to that autism. There was another issue with the study around GI distress or GI disease. And it turns out that even though they said that these children all had some GI disruption, actually, when the study was looked at later, none of the children had that link as well. So these studies have been, again, there's been many researchers working on this for many, many years, and there have been no findings that link MMR with autism.
Wonderful. So we can safely say that MMR and autism are not linked. And one thing I will actually say in here as well is that, since 1998, which was, gosh, over 20 years ago now, there's been so much more research into actually what causes autism. And so I think even if we look at this primarily from an autism perspective, that theory is debunked, given that there has just been so much more enlightenment on autism and its causes. And of course, some of it is still very murky, but we certainly know a lot more today than we did over 20 years ago.
Gosh, and that's a very good point, Zari, because I remember years ago when I was in my going to college and learning about autism, I think there were a lot of different theories because nobody knew, like a new appearance of a new entity, what's going on. And even I remember even being taught, or some of the students were being taught, that this was possibly related to parenting at the time, as opposed to any external factor. So any other external factor. So I think a lot of people were looking for answers, and then this came forward. And unfortunately, it's been exceedingly impactful because it has worried parents for some years.
Absolutely, which is the reason that we raised it, because we are still talking about this, unfortunately, and hopefully the conversation around this will start to decrease. And I just want to point out here, and something I should have mentioned at the beginning, is if any of you have any questions for Debra, please feel free to pop that in the Q&A box or even in the chat box, and we'll be more than happy to answer your questions either during or towards the end of the presentation. So Deb, this was a kind of a great segue into childhood vaccinations and childhood schedules. The first question I want to ask you is, well, what are the common childhood vaccinations? And can we kind of go through this a little bit and talk a little bit about the reasoning and the science behind actually having a schedule, as opposed to why can't I just go ahead and get it whenever I want?
First, I want to point out this is such a wonderful user-friendly schedule, and I think this is in our resource list at the end. Yep. You can just click on and find this. There are numerous vaccines for children, and they are in a schedule. Like you see the hepatitis at the top, rotavirus, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, the pneumococcals, polio, as we mentioned already, and of course MMR, varicella. And you see the different timing for all of the vaccines. The importance of the timing is pretty key, because what researchers have done is looked at the science of the vaccine itself, as well as the child's development of their own immune system. So the science behind why the vaccines are given when they are, when they can be most efficacious for the immune system of the child, and also understanding how to separate them based on the science and what the child can and can't use most efficiently. So the timing is really critical. And so this is such a wonderful user-friendly piece. So if you look at birth, hepatitis B is the vaccine given at birth. And the other piece I want to point out with timing is let's look at MMR, mumps, measles, and rubella. That vaccine is given at age 12 months and above. So it can't be given to children who are younger. And I'm going to bring this up because the timing means that some children, some babies, some infants have developed some immunity based on vaccine to some illnesses, but not to others. So when other children are not vaccinated, and a child who's maybe 9 months or 10 months, perhaps exposed to measles, mumps, rubella, then they're at risk because they cannot receive that vaccine until age 12 months.
Yes.
So that's something to keep in mind as we keep talking here this evening. But the timing is really important. Now, some parents might be concerned, gosh, what, maybe I missed a vaccine if they're trying to stay in schedule. And of course, that has become an issue with COVID, with people not going in for their routine vaccines. Well, science has also produced a schedule when you are behind in vaccines. There's specific science behind how to make up those vaccines, again, in a timed way. And so when you're going in, perhaps at this time now, maybe your child had missed some vaccines earlier because of what's gone on with COVID. There is science behind how those are chosen and at what frequency. Then they wouldn't be on the schedule right now. Your provider would look at what the schedule would be for your child's age and making up and getting them up to date. And then you would resume the normal schedule after that.
Exactly. So I think an important point that you're making here is that just because you're behind, don't assume that you've missed the boat. There's always a way.
Very good point. Yes.
Yeah. There's always a way to get that vaccination in, and you absolutely should go ahead and figure that out with your healthcare provider. One other interesting point that I want to raise here is, of course, looking at this, which is compliments of the CDC website, I think, is the varicella vaccine. And I certainly remember in my medical career, this was not part of the routine recommendations for children and was introduced as the varicella vaccine was developed. And so it's just very interesting to see how these things can change and develop and progress and are not static. It's a dynamic process.
That's right. And scientists meet regularly through the CDC. There's an independent panel. As new vaccines, as new information about even vaccines we've had for some time comes forward, that's analyzed on a regular basis on how this might change. So it is very dynamic.
Yeah. And one interesting thing here I want to point out also is the little picture here of the lady, the pregnant lady. The recommended time is the 27th through the 36th week of pregnancy for whooping cough vaccine. And again, that relates to the passive immunity antibodies that are passed through from your mum to the baby through the placenta. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Right. So the baby would have that protection if mother is vaccinated. And actually, this is something, even in our data, there is some issues of pregnant women not getting the vaccines that they need. So just as importantly for the children, when you are pregnant, to protect your child, you want to make sure that your vaccines are current.
Absolutely.
That's a very good point about the passive immunity through the placenta and through breast milk as well. That's another very good advantage of breastfeeding.
Yeah. Can we talk about, we've kind of gone through this schedule. I think we've really touched on the importance of having this schedule, but I just wanted to talk about sort of a real world example. And we had touched on polio before, but I think polio is just such an amazing success story when it comes to, the power of vaccines. And this is given to children, the polio vaccine. I mean, I still remember having mine, which was, years ago now, but can we talk a little bit more about polio, how it was developed and this success story?
Yes. It is an amazing success story. And polio actually, as a viral infection, was discovered in the late 1890s, almost 1900. And what it causes is flaccid limb. It affects the muscles. And it starts in the periphery, particularly in the legs, to the arms, ultimately to the muscles that help breathe. And if you've heard of the term iron lung, when people would become so flaccid that they can no longer breathe because they don't have the muscles to breathe anymore, and they would be put in a piece of equipment that would help them breathe. And people, certainly a paralysis of children. And actually, the disease peaked in the 1940s to 1950s and paralyzed or killed over 500,000 people worldwide every year. Really devastating. And then most people know that FDR, President Roosevelt, had polio, did end up eventually in a wheelchair. But his struggle led to the establishment of the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, better known as what we know as March of Dimes, that pioneered the vaccine for polio in 1955. And in a tremendously successful vaccine program, vaccinating everyone in the United States to the point where we in this country have been polio free since 1979. So that's everyone coming together and taking the vaccine, and that's the wonderful benefit. I will say, in some work I've done in the past, I was working in a refugee camp along the Thai-Cambodian border some years ago, and I had never seen polio here. And as we were entering the camp the very first day, because I can see the visual as I close my eyes now, there was a child carrying another child because the other child could not walk. And the child had these legs that were just completely flaccid, as if they were just rubber and were just moving around in free air. And I said, oh my gosh, I'm seeing polio for the first time myself as a clinician. So it is in other countries. And that's the reason why we vaccinate for polio. If we don't have the immunity, people could be traveling in from other countries that have polio. Or the reverse is, I've done a lot of travel globally in developing countries. And so getting a polio booster to go in countries where there's still polio.
Absolutely. I'm glad you raised that sort of that global aspect, because it was going to be my next question. I mean, I did a clinical term in Bangladesh where their vaccination rates are obviously not as good as in Australia, where I do all my practice. And I saw my first case of measles. I'd never seen measles before. And so to your point, you know, vaccination doesn't mean that you've eradicated it from the world unless the world has been vaccinated. So there is always that risk. We're sort of looking at the children from birth through to sort of 5 or 6. Of course, you know, vaccinations are lifelong, and we're now looking at the older age group. Can you explain this chart again, compliments of the CDC, to us a little bit?
Yes, so absolutely right. The children up to age 18, and we're not talking about adults, we all get vaccinated as well. But there is a schedule for those vaccines. And I do want to raise the point because we've talked about the impact of children and adolescents not receiving vaccines during COVID. Actually, the adolescents, the decrease in routine vaccines is down almost 35%. So that's very significant, particularly in the adolescent age. So we want to make sure that those children, as well as the younger ones, are coming back and getting their immunizations. So there are some additional immunizations, like for meningitis for children in that age, and also human papillomavirus.
Yeah.
So those are additional vaccines that come at a later age. And again, based on the science, you give it to children in a later age and not an earlier age.
Yeah, and again, the HPV vaccine is something that was introduced more recently for adolescents. And I think many older parents may not actually be aware of this. So it's definitely something to point out here is the HPV virus. And it's interesting that you mentioned the statistics around the downward trend in vaccinations during the pandemic. We had a webinar some weeks ago with a pediatrician on the ground who works in New Jersey, and she had the same comment that because of the pandemic, kids are not coming in for their routine well checks. They're not getting vaccinated. And she also made the same call for, you know, bringing your kids in and just either catching up or making sure you're on time.
Absolutely.
So with all the vaccines and the colorful graphs that we've just seen, one of the things that you hear is there's a certain amount of fear and anxiety, particularly from first-time parents, around the number or the sheer number of shots that these infants are receiving. Can we talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, and some parents are concerned about that. How can you give my child so many shots? And of course, children are crying. It seems it can be difficult, but actually, again, based on the science, the scientists look at, again, the child's immunity. I mean, the child's immune status, their own immune system as it's growing, knowing best when each vaccine can be provided. And even though they're given multiple vaccines at once, their immune systems can handle it. All the studies have demonstrated that. And it is really not something to worry about. It can be, being in a pediatric office when you're hearing a lot of crying, it is hard to hear that. But it is not harmful to the child at all. It's not. Based on the research and the science and understanding the infant's how the infant's immune system works.
Thank you. And I think we've already probably touched on this, but this is certainly a feeling or a sentiment that is out there at the moment. You can or should delay routine vaccinations until the coronavirus pandemic is over. And this actually relates to adults as well. We shouldn't just necessarily narrow this to kids. What are your thoughts on this? I think we've made it pretty clear, but just to reiterate.
Yes. Actually, for those of us who follow this, there is concern with so many not receiving the routine vaccines. Could we actually, on top of the pandemic we're in, see outbreaks of other infectious diseases, which we really don't want to see? We already have enough on our plate handling this pandemic. So that's another reason, just in a general sense, that we don't want to see outbreaks of other other vaccine preventable illnesses during this time of a pandemic. So yes, very important to get back into that office, make an appointment. Many offices in many places are making it easier to receive the vaccine in a very safe way. If you're concerned, I suggest calling your office or the health department where you may be getting your immunizations for your children. Ask ahead, plan. But I know everyone in these practices are very eager to provide you and provide your children with immunizations and help fill whatever gaps have occurred over the last year. Very important.
And I'm glad that you raised this question of planning ahead for any kind of concern or hesitancy. And again, we're going to speak about this in a little while. Your healthcare professionals are there to speak with you in a non-judgmental kind of fashion. So really, a lot of this is just about education and being informed and doing what is right. So this kind of segues into a brief conversation about vaccine hesitancy, which again is something that we've been hearing a lot about and something that's been happening over the last many years, maybe kick-started by the MMR controversy.
Yeah, it seemed to, I would agree, perhaps it was kick-started a bit by that. The first one mentions unsafe toxins. There was concern some years ago. Thimerosal, you may have heard of that, is a type of mercury-based preservative, and it used to be used in many vaccines. And then in the late 1990s, and there, as a country, we're trying to remove mercury as much as we could from our country. And they were actually, as of 2001, no vaccines have thimerosal or any mercury-based preservative in them except influenza, but you can get a thimerosal-free influenza vaccine. So they are available. So again, let me say, since 2001, any mercury-based preservative has been removed from all vaccines except some influenza vaccines, but there are thimerosal-free ones available for influenza.
How would someone access that influenza vaccine if that's what they wanted? Is that just a conversation?
I would say, yes, you just ask, because it should be offered usually places that have, whenever you're getting an influenza vaccine, they usually have a variety. There's some for older people, and then they have the ones for everyone else, and they have a variety usually to choose from. And each year that is posted by the CDC, what those vaccines will be for each year, because our influenza vaccine does change annually.
Yeah.
And so sometimes the formulations change a bit. And so again, ask for the thimerosal free if you'd like, and that is always available every year.
Great. Vaccines can cause disease in my child, and I think this relates back to the use of injecting, those tiny little bits of live virus. I think that possibly may come from that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, probably there's that concern. I mean, that might be where that myth is coming from. And certainly with that, when we get an immunization, sometimes there can be a little bit of reaction. And so that could create some fear. And the reaction could be a mild fever, the child could be fussy for a couple of days. That's really the body's response to the vaccine actually stimulating the immune system, which is a good thing. So it's not to worry you. But no, that vaccine will not actually cause the disease. It does not.
I'm glad you raised this question of fever. And again, fever, I think, is a red flag for many parents. And certainly from a medical perspective, when we think about fever, it actually is telling us that the child's immune system is working. As you say, this is the child's body mounting an attack against its attackers, and that is really what a fever represents. And it's really how quickly that fever goes up, as opposed to the fever itself, that is more of concern. So again, as you say, in terms of vaccines, if you're getting fever as a side effect, it's the immune system kind of doing its job, which is good news.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk a little bit about contraindications to vaccines, the immunocompromised, the immunosuppressed populations? These are obviously special populations.
There are, yes. And that actually, I'm glad that is here, because that's another aspect of why we want to vaccinate all of our children, because there are some that may not be able to get a vaccine, or they're on a different schedule because of their immune system. And examples of that would be children who are in chemotherapy, perhaps children that have HIV, children with stem cell transplants, immunoglobulin deficiency, children with that. Also, a child that maybe had to have their spleen removed. Those are all children that cannot be on a normal schedule. So maybe they're not getting some vaccines until later. And if there's a number of children around them that have not been vaccinated, could spread that disease it could infect those children that haven't been able to be vaccinated, or are on a more latent schedule because of their underlying illnesses.
Right. We're sort of shifting now away from childhood vaccines to the COVID-19 vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that we hear a lot of, and it relates back to the vaccine hesitancy that we spoke about a little earlier. The COVID-19 vaccine is not safe because it was rapidly developed and tested. Can you put this in perspective for us?
Yes. Well, first of all, there's two technologies, and the Pfizer Moderna technology is the mRNA, or memory RNA technology. I think we spoke about this a little bit earlier. So it is a little bit different. Essentially, it's a little piece of code that the vaccine delivers to your cells. The code serves as an instruction manual for your immune system to actually, so that it teaches it to recognize COVID-19. So even though it seems brand new, it actually has been around for, like I think I said, a couple of decades. And for treatment for cancer, even though that treatment isn't available yet. That's what they're studying. Also, I think the Ebola vaccine, they were using it for developing the Ebola vaccine. So this is a technology that's been around for some time, and it's, I will say, being involved with immunizations for so long, it's so successful so far that now they're looking at it, really looking at it. I think they're looking at it even more promising for cancer treatments in the future and future vaccines. But yes, it has been around some time. The other is, I think being rapid. The thing that has been a bit different that was faster, and it's fair to say that usually after those so many, like about a year of clinical trials, there might be another stage of the clinical trial before it's for the bigger population. And that is a little bit earlier. That's why it's called emergency use. We have a pandemic. So the efficacy that was shown on very large clinical trials or research, many thousands of people involved, 30, 60,000, I think, for each of these trials for those for the mRNA as well as J&J. So many people were involved with the trials. They had enough people and the efficacy was high enough that they were allowed for what we call emergency use. And we are using them in that capacity. Yes, most vaccines probably were not getting them at emergency use because there's not an emergency. And they might have been studied further with much larger numbers of people. So that is a little bit different this time. But we have a pandemic and over 500,000 people dead in our country from this pandemic. So that's justification for emergency use. We have used, and let me just go to emergency use when you hear that coming from the CDC. We've used other medications for emergency use as well. This is not unusual or just for immunizations where there is a disease, people are very seriously ill, and something is so incredibly promising that it's been allowed to be used in emergency use capacity. So that term and using something in that capacity has been done before, not only for these vaccines.
Yeah, and I think it just speaks to the agility that we have to have in these particular circumstances, right? And what you're actually saying is this rapidity that we've been using these vaccines with, again, because we have a pandemic. I think the other question here, or the other idea to sort of talk about, is that some of the other vaccines that we've been using for many years that people are comfortable with and sure have gone through all the stages of the clinical trials for 12 months or 15 months or what have you, they were done years ago as well. And so I think the technology and the science has also improved drastically over recent years, which is great for us, but that's also a part explanation, I think, of the rapidity with which we've been able to develop these vaccines.
Zarmi, you bring up a very interesting point. I think also our ability to construct clinical trials that give us the best answers have improved as well. So that's also a part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go a little bit more specifically into the 3 FDA-approved vaccines. Of course, Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. There are others around the world that are being used, but they're not currently approved in the United States. So just very briefly, because we do have some questions, can we touch on the Pfizer and then we'll kind of go forward to Moderna?
Yes, Pfizer is an mRNA vaccine. It is available for ages 16 and above. That's the only one of the 3 for COVID that is for age 16 to 16 and above. The efficacy, again, efficiency, the effectiveness of that vaccine in the clinical trial was 95%. Right now, both Moderna and Pfizer are conducting clinical trials on teens, ages 12 to 17. And so the thought is these are moving ahead beautifully as people are watching the clinical trials. I have actually read that there's a lot of interest, and parents have enrolled their children in these trials around the country. And the thought is at this point that perhaps they might be available for emergency use by this summer, which of course would help prepare for fall going back to school.
Yeah, that would be amazing. I think the children are really most heavily impacted by the pandemic. And do we have any information as to when we think the data will be available?
That I haven't been able to find. I haven't found any data about it yet, and I haven't seen any real conferences or sort of webinars that are really addressing it at this point, which they started to do with Pfizer and Moderna when they were first starting to find some data, and you would capture some of that information, but I haven't found that yet. And then in terms of Pfizer and Moderna, they think if this is how successful this is for the ages 12 to 17, that perhaps then will soon start after that looking and testing are doing clinical trials on children aged 6 months and above.
Right. So Moderna, similar to Pfizer.
Absolutely, 94% as opposed to 95%. Again, clinical trials in the same age group, the 12 to 17, Moderna is running right now as well. But theirs is 18 and above. So the only one we have right now for age 16 and above is Pfizer.
Right. So that will at least get the high school students in.
That's
And
right. That's right.
Johnson and Johnson, which, had a lot of ups and downs, unfortunately, and received a lot of bad press. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts about the Johnson and Johnson vaccine overall, and then what's been happening recently as well?
Sure. Well, the Johnson & Johnson technology is sort of our traditional virus-based technology was used. It's a disabled adenovirus, not a coronavirus. And it's in no way related to coronavirus. However, and it's, again, a completely different virus from coronavirus is adenovirus, but it's inactivated, and it also delivers instructions to our body and how to defeat the coronavirus, say we were to be exposed. And it cannot replicate in your body. It will not give you a viral infection in any way. But again, a more traditional viral technology was used for J&J. And I have to say, in my state, I'm in North Carolina, people's interest in J&J, of course, before this most recent issue around blood clots, was that people were actually more interested in the J&J than the other vaccines. And I think part of it was people are familiar with Johnson & Johnson, as well as maybe more comfortable with the more traditional technology that was used. But so the other benefit, and we didn't even mention that with Moderna and Pfizer, you have to get 2 vaccines, and the timing of the 2 immunizations, and the timing is important. So with Pfizer, it's 4 weeks when you get the first vaccine. Sorry, I'm wrong. If Pfizer is 3 weeks apart, you get the first one, and then 3 weeks later, you get the second. With Moderna, you get injection number 2, and then the next injection number, you get injection number 1, injection number 2 is 4 weeks later. With J&J, the other advantage is this 1 injection, and you're done. So there are advantages to J&J, particularly with getting to populations that are more remote. And of course, when we think about the global pandemic, really important to make it easy with 1 injection. Also, it doesn't require deep freeze or real heavy refrigeration compared to the other vaccines. Yeah. So it has that ease of delivery that a lot of people like. Now, there's been, of course, a lot of discussion and concern. It was pulled for a while because of blood clots that did occur in a very minute population, but I believe there was 1 death and then other people were hospitalized. That's, again, a small number, I think 8 or 9 people total of all the millions that have received the J&J vaccine. The literature and how it was reviewed by the scientists feel that the outcome was, yes, there is a warning now for women under the age of 50 who receive J&J to look for symptoms of blood clots. And so maybe those women would prefer the other vaccine over J&J, but certainly they can still receive the J&J vaccine. A direct cause effect was not found, like, oh yes, this vaccine definitely causes these blood clots. And that's why it came back and is available to people. But now a warning to look for signs and symptoms of blood clots for that particular group.
Yeah, and I think just again, if you're looking at J&J and putting it into perspective, I mean, the UK has done a phenomenal job using J&J to vaccinate their population, and their rates, of course, have just plummeted. I think mostly thanks to J&J. And in fact, they were aware of the blood clots, but rather than pull the J&J, they issued that warning immediately so that people were aware and could make that choice. So of course, when you pull a vaccine, nobody has access to it. But correct me if I'm wrong, all the subjects or the people that had blood clots were all women. So potentially men, were they all women, or am I wrong
Well,
there?
I will say that there was a case, I think within the last week, where there was 1 man
Okay.
again in the age under 50,
Right.
with the same kind of blood clot. That was the first one that we know of. So the warning still is for women under the age of 50. He fell in the same age group, but it was one man so far. Again, in a population, and it's really, when you're thinking of a whole population of people or 1 million people, how many could get a blood clot for any other reason? They
Yes.
could. And so that's why it's hard, as you're saying, well, is it really related to the vaccine or not? When would they have gotten it anyways? Because things happen and people get illnesses or get blood clots. So again, not a direct cause effect was found.
Yeah. And just to parallel with other countries, again, in Australia, for example, with AstraZeneca and the recent issues with AstraZeneca, again, it's this particular age group of under 50 and over 50. So the AstraZeneca is actually, not being offered to a certain population, but being offered to another population, which does not fall under that risk category. So there are ways to kind of mitigate, those concerns.
And we're lucky because we have a choice. We have options, and there's plenty of vaccine. We're a very lucky country. We have plenty of vaccine for everyone.
Yeah.
So most places have choices. Yes.
So just 5 fast myths here, because there were so many, but we wanted to get these in. Would you mind just going through these really quickly for us? COVID-19 vaccines do not
cause COVID. Again, the mRNA technology has no viral component to it whatsoever. And the J&J has the adenovirus that's inactivated, that doesn't cause illness and has no relation to coronavirus at all. So no, the COVID-19 vaccines do not cause COVID. Now, the next issue here is infertility and miscarriage. At this point, no, there's been no correlation between the vaccine and infertility or miscarriage. In fact, the opposite in terms of providing protection for the mother. The concern is if the mother does get COVID-19, there has been an increase in miscarriage in women who are COVID-19 positive. So it's actually the reverse issue, is you want to protect the mother so she doesn't have a miscarriage by getting the COVID-19 vaccine.
There's a lot of talk about fetal tissue, I think particularly with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine.
Yes, there was discussion that was there fetal tissue in the vaccine itself, and there is not. And in one religion, Catholicism actually came out with a statement saying that that was the case, and certainly encouraged their parishioners to not be concerned about receiving the J&J vaccine.
Right. Contain microchips.
Yes, that has been something that's been discussed or out there in the social media universe. There are no microchips in these vaccines. Again, the technologies that we explained do not contain any microchips. Yeah.
And we touched on this, but just wanted to reiterate, causes significant morbidity or mortality, so illness and death.
No, the vaccines are not causing that. Quite the opposite. Look at what has happened in our country with the death rate. It has come down. Infection rates have come down, although we're starting to see some issues in certain areas of the country. But it has had a positive impact that fewer people are getting infected and fewer are dying at the very high rate we had earlier, because more and more people are getting vaccinated. And I want to touch on, because we talked about herd immunity, and that's, of course, a discussion. This word is coming out so much because of COVID, and people wonder about it with COVID. Herd immunity, as I explained earlier, where one can, if enough people are vaccinated, or there's enough immunity in a population, then those who are unable to be vaccinated would be protected. And how many people would that take to develop herd immunity? Well, it is different for each illness or each disease, each infection. It's based on how easily that germ or that virus is transmitted. So with the science of knowing the ease of transmission of COVID, currently the understanding is we would have to have 70% of our population immune to COVID to develop herd immunity.
And this relates to the variants as well?
Correct. Right now, our vaccines protect us against the variants that are predominantly in our country. There is concern, and that's a good point you bring up, because there's other variants, one from South Africa, one from Brazil. I know the one in Brazil was found, I think, in New York City. I think that's been tamped down. I haven't heard about more of an outbreak of that. Those two variants are of concern because we're not sure the amount of protection one would get from the current COVID vaccines. So that's another reason why we want people vaccinated. When there's so much circulating virus, then we can develop more and more variants. And so that's the importance of rapidly vaccinating everyone so that we don't develop variants that then these vaccines would not be able to protect us from. That is really the race. Why are we wanting to vaccinate people so quickly and so many so quickly? That is a big reason. We don't want those kinds of variants to be developed in our own country, and we certainly want to protect ourselves from ones that are coming in from other countries, which has already happened. Again, pointing to a global pandemic. Not only do we want to be vaccinated, we want to vaccinate the world and try to eradicate this terrible infection.
Yeah, absolutely. So segueing into, in an ideal world, here we are, we've had our COVID vaccination. How should we behave?
Well, the science is changing because we're learning more and more all the time. And I think that sometimes confuses a lot of people. I know my family and myself, I'll get online and double check something or this or that, because you say, how did they tell us to do this before and this now? Why did it change? Because the science changes. If you can imagine, we have something completely new that people don't know, we knew nothing about just over a year ago. So as people are vaccinated, we're understanding more about transmission, and we're getting better and better at testing. All those things play into some of the decisions that are made and how decisions change about what's safe and what's not. Now, do you need to wear a mask after you get vaccinated? The new CDC guidance says no mask outside in a crowd. So that's really exciting because the understanding is we have enough immunity and the outside transmission is low that one would not need a mask outside if you're not, if you're not in a crowd. If you're in a crowd, it is still that you should wear a vaccine because you're in very close proximity. If you can imagine a sporting event, you're crowded into a musical event, you're all very close to each other. That's why you want to wear a vaccine, even if you're immunized, because remember, we talked about efficacy. It's not 100%. It is very high, but it's not 100%. So there will be some transmission, even if one is vaccinated.
Yeah.
And no mask inside with others who are fully vaccinated. Yes, and that's very exciting. So, and I've done that in our own household where someone is fully vaccinated. Yes, come on in and we're all together and we don't wear a mask. And that's really, it's really a wonderful thing.
Yeah, and it's an important point that you raised that, the uncertainty lies in the fact that this is all new and we are still learning, and this is why recommendations do change. It's not necessarily that mistakes are being made, but as more information comes along, we're able to, again, be more agile in our conclusions. And yeah, this is amazing news. It's really great news. We do have a few questions, Deb. So really quickly, let's go. You know what? Let's actually take the questions first, and then we'll be able to get to the takeaways. So I'm just going to stop this for now.
Alrighty.
So the first question I have is, do we know if the CDC will at some point say no masks in the gym? It's so hard to breathe while working out. I absolutely agree with that. Not that I've tried to work out too much recently.
I know a lot of people are looking forward to that. And I mean, I think, again, as we Could that happen? Absolutely. Down the road, I think as more and more people are vaccinated, you have less circulating virus. And so then you start seeing in your community or in your area that the number of people that are getting new infections, that new infection rate starts dropping more and more and more. And that will be impactful as the CDC is making decisions along the way.
Great. Another question I have, I already had COVID-19 and I recovered. So I don't need to get a COVID-19 vaccine when it's available. Is this true?
That's actually not the recommendation. The recommendation is that 90 days after your infection is that you should receive the vaccine. We still are not sure, and part of that is some lack of certainty of how long that natural immunity, that would be called natural immunity, lasts. We don't know. And we don't, and how strong the immunity is, we're not sure. So that's why the recommendation is wait the 90 days and then after your infection and then get vaccinated. So yes, one should.
Yeah, and this could also actually relate to this question of boosters as well, even with the acquired immunity that we're getting from vaccinations, where there is definitely research into getting boosters, and it may well be that just like the flu shot, which we get yearly, we may have to get a COVID-19 shot yearly.
Yes, in fact, I believe Pfizer and Moderna are both looking, I know Pfizer for sure, maybe Moderna looking into and developing boosters. We're still not sure how, because we actually are still not sure how long does the immunity last for the vaccine we received.
Mm.
And you're right, very similar to influenza, it might be something that we're getting annually.
Yeah, and a last question here. Is there any possibility or need to wait for a vaccine that may be more effective in the future?
Yeah. Really, these are actually very, very effective vaccines as far as vaccines go. I mean, it's really amazing the technology that has created the level of effectiveness of these vaccines. So the recommendation is get the vaccine now. Yes, maybe something else will come out down the road, but get the vaccine now. You don't want to risk getting the infection. As we've probably all heard about people who are infected, of course, the risk of death or being in intensive care for a very long time and having permanent disability, the long haulers that have illness and shortness of breath and all kinds of other sequelae or secondary issues related to their illness a year later. So you don't want to risk getting it. So get the vaccine. These are highly effective. Get it now. And we'll all see where the science is going to take us. So don't delay.
Yeah. Do we know why it seems side effects are occurring more in the second shot than for the vaccine rather than the first shot?
I don't have an answer for that. And I don't know that anyone does, but I'm going to give you my own personal experience. I got Moderna and I had more of a reaction after the first one. So not that terrible. I was fatigued. I kept sleeping like for a couple of days going, why am I wanting to sleep all the time? And I got chilled and I thought, but then I was bracing myself. Okay, for the second one, I can only imagine what's going to happen and nothing. So do we know? No. And does it mean if you didn't have a reaction, you have less or more of whatever's going to happen from the vaccine? I mean, actually, those are things we just don't know. So it is really varied too. I mean, I guess we've all communicated with different friends or colleagues that got the vaccine. Some nothing happened. Others I had a friend that was sick for a couple of days. So it's so varied, and that's part of it we might not quite understand yet.
Yeah, and it may be something that's more personal to do with the person than the vaccine itself. So, I mean, certainly more areas for study there. Deb, if there were just 5 things that you would want people to take away from our conversation today, what would they be?
Well, we have these lovely 5 takeaways right here. Look, at the vaccines prevent 2 to 3 million lost lives every year. That's tremendous. They really are just, we all practice some prevention, or we try to. Maybe we choose not to smoke because we want to live longer. Vaccines prevent disease. So wouldn't we want to participate in that? So that's an important piece, and just it's an amazing breakthrough in science in this century to have immunizations available to us to prevent infection. Certainly, the diseases do spread faster in communities with higher percentages of people who are not vaccinated. And we've had measles outbreaks in our country over the last 10 years because of that. And so we don't want that to happen. And you care for your child, you make incredible decisions about their health and their future every day. So vaccines are one of the most effective ways to protect your child from life-threatening illnesses. And they're one of the best tools to help prevent disease and death in both children and adults, as we've been saying. We haven't talked about adult immunizations, but they're equally as important. And I think the final one is so critical. You have questions, you may still have concerns. You can walk away from this event today and have many questions. That's what your provider is there for. They want to answer your questions. Never hesitate to ask. Never hesitate to say, I'm hesitant. I don't know that I want this for my child, or I don't know if I want it for myself. That's what you're there for. Ask the questions, and they're happy to address your concerns. Never hesitate to do that.
Yeah, and I think that's vital, going back to this idea of non-judgment. If you have questions, no one is going to judge you for that. In fact, I think it's great to have questions. We should all be curious and want to be able to make informed decisions. So absolutely. Deb, this brings us to the end of our conversation. Deb has very kindly shared some resources with us. I don't know if there's anything you want to particularly point out here.
The first several are those, you can go right to those links, and that's right to the CDC, and get that lovely schedule. You might want to print that out. It's easily, they have printable versions. They had the family-friendly version of the schedule, the vaccine schedule for children. Vaccinate Your Family is a wonderful resource, well respected in the science community, but it's really focused on talking to you as a family member. It has the science, but it's not in a lot of scientific terminology. It's a wonderful resource, wonderful tools there. And the American College of Pediatrics, often a place I will go for the most current information about vaccines. So why we have these is that there is a lot of misinformation on the web, and we know that. So if you pull up vaccine, and even the title of what you might be reading sounds like it's vaccine friendly, but may not be in providing misinformation. So it's very important to go to reliable resources.
Yeah, and then the third one here, how vaccines for children work, is a great video. Yeah, which is a
Sorry, I missed that.
No,
but it's a wonderful video.
Yeah.
I think you would enjoy it. Children would understand it. It's really accessible and explains a lot of what we've talked about today in a very accessible way.
Yeah, I think it's a great one for kids to watch with parents. So Deb, thank you so much for your time today. I think it was a really revealing conversation. If anybody out there has questions or concerns, Deb is available on our platform, so f2fhealth.com. What you would need to do is go to our care section and book a care session with Deb, and she would absolutely be more than happy to answer your questions. Yes. Deb, thank you again. Any parting comments from you?
No, I want to thank you for this opportunity. This is such an important topic, and I welcome you looking for me on the website, and I'd love to meet up with you. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. And before we sign off for tonight, because I know we are a few minutes over, next week we have another very interesting discussion with a homeopathic doctor, Dr. Sergei Krysowiak. So I do hope that you can join us for next week's webinar, and I'm sure we will be touching on perhaps a couple of the things that we talked about today, but from a slightly different perspective. So thank you once again, everyone, for joining us. We do hope that you learned and that you were able to take something away from tonight's presentation. Have a great evening, and we will see you next week.